I think is really, really fascinating, and maybe an immeasurable impact that Genghis Khan had is on trade. And, you could say a lot of stuff, but basically establishing a unified trade network that spanned, I don't know how many thousands of kilometers. And there's a lot of interesting things that were done to enable that trade. One is providing safety and security of not just the envoys, like we mentioned, for communication in the military context, but for the merchants. Can you speak to what Genghis Khan did for the trade network connected to the Silk Road, as an example?
Nomads in general are interested in trade. And throughout most of history, they have been the traders who carried the goods from one city to another, or one oasis to another. And so the Mongols were also extremely interested and extremely dependent. They could create very little in their home country. They couldn't grow hardly anything, and they didn't have the technological skills for most of the crafts. So they're very dependent on trade.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they raised the status of merchants very high. This was particularly a problem in the Chinese world. It wasn't so much in the Christian or the Muslim world, but certainly in the Chinese world, where merchants were considered extremely low. And all of a sudden, he raises them up above scholars. They're going to have certain rights. For example, they get to be taxed one time. Whatever the national tax is, that's it. They're not taxed every time they stop in some new town. And he created a set of what we would call rest houses or recuperation centers where they could get fresh horses, they could get food, they could deposit their money and get paper receipts that could be used anywhere in the empire. They were guaranteed protection. If they had to pass through an area where it might be dangerous, then a small group, a squad of men and horses would go with them. So trade was extremely important. And then the Mongols, they supported trade in a very odd way. And that is, the merchants would come in and they would ask for an outrageous price for some goods, much more than they should get, waiting for the Mongols to bargain them down. And the Mongols would say, I'll give you much more than that. It was just, and his grandson or his son, Agode Khan, was once asked, why do you do that? You got to stop doing that. This was a Muslim financial advisor he'd called in. He told him, well, you've got to stop paying more than people ask. And then Agode said, where's the money going to go? It's still in my empire. It's going to come back eventually, And so they had a much different attitude with great respect. And I think a symbol of that is in the time of Kublai Khan, when we see that his uncle and father went to China and came back from China. And then on the second trip, Marco Polo went with them to China and back. They were safe the whole way. Their goods were safe. They came back with tremendous amount of wealth. They were never harassed. And the mere fact that they could cross, it took 2 years, but the mere fact that they could cross the whole continent safely and come back, that was unprecedented. We really don't have any well-documented case of anybody, say, from China visiting Europe or Europe visiting China before the Mongols. But since Genghis Khan, there's never been a year without contact between East and West. It was permanent. Once he created it, it was permanent.
I don't think it's possible to measure the positive impact of that, because it wasn't just trade of goods. It was also exchange, explicit or implicit along the way, exchange of ideas, whether that's exchange of technologies, exchange of like philosophical ideas, scientific ideas, technical, mathematical ideas, all of this spread throughout and constantly circulating. Maybe can you speak to that aspect of it?
Yes. It was an exchange of ideas on every level. Ideas, technology, ideologies, beliefs, scientific information, everything was being exchanged, even agricultural goods of new crops for new areas. But Genghis Khan, he had a part of his genius of organization was knowing what skill people had that would contribute towards his empire. For example, the Muslims were very good with arithmetic. In fact, he conquered the little empire of Khwarezm, from which we get the word algorithm. because there was a mathematician there who invented algorithms. And so Khwarezm belonged to him. He conquered it very quickly, very easily, no problem. But it belonged to him. But the Muslims were using the zero. The Mongols were absolutely impressed with that. The Chinese less so. They're very suspicious about the zero. But the Mongols were very impressed because herders' numbers are important to them for keeping up with their animals. In fact, the Mongols have a simple system. They reduce all animals to the number of horses. You can ask somebody how many animals you can have, and they can say, well, 100 horses. And it doesn't mean they have 100 horses. It's going to be like 5 cows count as 4 horses, 5 sheep or 5 goats count as 1 horse, 4 camels count as 5 horses. So they reduced it all down like that. The Mongols take a census of everything. And that's one of the first things Genghis Khan did. And that was one of the demands he made of every place he went, is a complete census of your people. And every house had to post outside how many people, how many animals, what did they do, the occupations, all this information. So they needed good mathematics for this. The Muslims provided it. So they took the Muslims to China, these Middle Eastern scholars and all. Unfortunately, they were rather ruthless sometimes when it came to implementing the tax policies, but they became the financial advisors to him. Other groups of people had other roles like that, and he was moving them around constantly. And so you had a combination. As I said, he himself had that genius for combining new bits of technology, but it created a new kind of cultural spirit in which other people were also combining technology at other levels and being encouraged. It was no longer heresy or the devil's work to bring in this thing. So we had the spread of printing, for example. We had the partial spread of something such as print money. For example, we had almanacs being created now through printing that combined different calendars and different information that was coming along. But one simple but lethal form of technology was that, for example, Chinese had gunpowder. Mostly it was used for fireworks, religious things. And then sometimes in warfare it was used for a kind of primitive hand grenade or a primitive bomb that could be thrown with a trebuchet. And this is in the time of Kublai Khan War, the grandson. But so they had that. The Middle Eastern, the Muslims, they had, and the Byzantines especially, they had naphtha, what we call Greek fire, flamethrowers that could set things on fire. You know, the Europeans did not excel very much in technology. They were behind in almost everything, but they could cast bells for churches. Okay, let's take that bell and we're going to turn it on its side. And we're going to use some principles of the flamethrower. And we're going to use the gunpowder from China. And you've got a cannon. So the Mongols, even early on, by the time they got to the siege of Baghdad, but not, I think, in the lifetime of Genghis Khan, but soon thereafter in his sons and grandsons, they were using some very primitive forms of cannon and even something like firing rods. We can't even call it anything like a rifle, but it could fire a very small ballistic device and all. So this combination of metallurgy, gunpowder, flamethrowers, you put it all together and you come up with something incredibly different.